Randomizers aren't a new thing, existing since the early 2000s and becoming quite popular sometime in the 2012s, most notably through the Pokemon series. From there they kept growing in popularity, Super Metroid being randomized as a fun method of speedrunning against each other, along with games like Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. There's even a randomizer that combines the SNES games of Zelda and Metroid together, having to find items between the two in order to progress through the run. However, this is barely scratching the surface of randomizers that are out there. Dark Cloud has a chest randomizer, Smash Bros. Ultimate has a World of Light randomizer, Resident Evil 4 Enemy Merchant, Paper Mario, Fallout 4, Skyrim, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. But why? There are so many of these things out there. Even Artplay, the developer of Bloodstained, made a randomizer mode as an update. It's a niche mode of play that's picked up in popularity. I noticed Scott Falco talking about these games at one point, Super Beard Bros were playing through a Pokemon randomizer, not to mention how easy it is to find someone streaming something related to it. So I figured, why not? And decided to do what any self-respecting online personality does with a trending topic. Ride their coattails to success. I stumbled into three things back in 2016: ROM hacks, randomizers, and the use of hats as a personality trait. My classic gaming itch was freshly scratched finding ROM hacks for the Pokemon series, the creativity of something like Snakewood, the many challenges and Nido takes with Ashgray, Jupiter, and... But the ROM hacks didn't stop with Pokemon. Classic titles like Super Mario RPG had their own takes with the infamous SMRPG Armageddon. Of course, more have come to be created by talented people over the years, not to mention the slew of Pokemon versions that have been given this treatment. So why don't we take a look into the world of randomizers with Mega Man X. There's a classic title. Developed by Capcom in the tail end of 1993, this was the reboot to the classic series, simply known as Mega Man. Our Blue Bomber got an overhaul in speed and utility, not only being able to move more quickly and platform with a dash ability, but also utilizing the boss powers you gain to affect your environment, not to mention the upgrades to your health, armor, and sub-tanks you find along the way. I'm going to lay things out as orderly as I can to avoid jumping around a lot while reverse engineering what's happening. I'll be running through a list of various objects that are being altered and or affected as shown on screen. Why refer to them as objects? Because my brain understands JavaScript methods a little more than the monstrosity that is assembly. When it comes to the Super Nintendo, there are two directions, an X-axis and a Y-axis, with diagonal lines technically making it 8 directions for movement. Now X can move left and right and jump upwards, though his jump isn't considered a vertical movement, but wall jumping and sliding is. I also thought that jumping while moving would be a diagonal movement, but apparently not. X can only move in a diagonal line when moving across a slanted plane. Now this, as far as I could tell, is due to what is considered ground mode, according to Wikibooks. The modes of movement that I can differentiate in this game are running, dashing, jumping, wall sliding, and ladder climbing. The run movement tends to pull slightly slower when going left, with the value being increased while running right. As I mentioned earlier, X doesn't speed up when jumping. It's only when he's hitting that uphill slant that he seems to speed up, while going downhill in the opposite direction he slows down. It almost seems like the values aren't necessarily being randomized in all directions. X and Y seems to have its own thing going. Vertical seems to be fast regardless, so I wonder if that might be one value. It also seems like the diagonal value is actually mirrored. When it comes to enemy units, they seem to be set in stone for the most part. Animations looked proper and movement isn't impeded, including the boss units, which leads me to think that the movement values are strictly set for X. However, I did notice that the bats were affected in their movement values, which is interesting because they seem to be moving similar to how the weapon objects are moving. Yeah, as far as platforms go, the only thing I saw different was the elevator and Boomer Kawanger stage, though that may have just been a glitch. Weapons are a bit more complex when it comes to movement. For the most part, X's fully charged attacks, shotgun ice, torpedoes, E-spark, needles, and boomerangs fall into the same object class. Firing left is extremely slow, firing right is extremely fast, and diagonals share similar speeds to X's movement. In fact, they're almost the same, save for the left-facing movement being slower. Now when it comes to the tornado, flamethrower, and rolling shield, things get a bit muddy. From what I can see, the tornado, both charged and standard, keeps to a set animation, which suggests there are no movement values to apply here, which would mean the original attack was also programmed differently than other projectiles. The same can almost be said for the flamethrower, though the charged variant moves with such extreme speed that it doesn't even hit the ground, much like the rolling shield with the exception of having some descent. My best guess here is either these attacks have their own object class that's become extra wonky, or it's just another minor glitch similar to the baseball things Sigma's final form throws out. For the sake of simplicity, I'll go ahead and label most of the attacks presented by enemies, as well as X's Lemons and mid-charge attack, as animation frames rather than weapon objects. The reason for this is that there's no value change that I can see, and given that there have been no discernible changes in certain enemy movements, I can only assume that certain enemy attacks are also set as animation frames rather than weapon or player objects. The miners still throw their pickaxes in the same arc, flamethrowers still have the same length and reach, etc, etc. There are a couple of exceptions. The first being the snowball machines in Penguin stage, since their projectiles seem to fall into the weapon object class, with the minor glitch of sometimes throwing directly downward. There's also the same effect noticeable for the small bats as mentioned before. However, there is one particular boss that almost broke me as hard as it tried to break the game. Are you weak to— What the fuck is going on? Wow, that does nothing to you. Alright. I don't know what his head thing is doing. Stop. What? That's not fair. The best answer I have for this situation is a conflict of programming. What would normally happen is Kawanger would send out his horns, the horns would fly forward in a direction, then upon reaching its max distance, would begin an arc cycle returning to Kawanger. However, the issue here is that as Kawanger fires the horns, they travel much further than they should. And since some of these shots are going off screen, which removes them as an object, he then fires another, and another, and this loop results in Kawanger firing madly until one starts to make its return cycle or he gets interrupted. Then he stops firing and goes into his movement phase. I figured once I got the ability that, at the very least, it would fire more appropriately. Oh! Now, damage values are by far my favorite thing to pick apart. The initial thought process was along the lines of Lemons being a value of 1 damage, dealing that 1 damage to enemies, with other abilities having a larger or smaller value based on charge or if the enemy is weak to it. This is not the case. Rather, the damage value is based on the unit being attacked, not the weapon. For instance, Lemons would have a base value of 1 when attacking most enemies, but some bosses were either taking no damage or exorbitant amounts. This is both unexpected and fascinating. My favorite example of this is using the strongest charge shot that the X-Buster has when it's upgraded. Not only does the front technically have 3 objects being fired at the same time, but the back arc is also its own attack. And as you can see here with this turret, it tanks that front end and does not die. And yet when you see here with Sigma at the end, he is getting slaughtered by it. Usually it wouldn't do that much damage and you would have to use the rolling shield to do that extra hit. I can't help but be fascinated by the fact that every unit in this game, from what I can tell, has its own damage values built into it, rather than the attacks having the damage value. Which makes it feel even more random whenever you're hitting things with lemons or ice shots or tornadoes, and you're wondering how much damage is something going to take, or will it even hurt it at all? And it's all dependent on that unit. I'm still diving into the world of programming and coding, but getting to reverse engineer this randomizer is helping me to understand the logic and process behind the scenes, which is a fun way of learning how these ROM hacks work, and getting to pick up a little bit of game design as well. With that being said, what's next on the list? Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Did you find it interesting? Am I just wildly naive about the whole process? Talk about it in the comments down below. And if you wouldn't mind, leave a thumbs up or thumbs down. Feedback helps to improve the channel, so it would be much appreciated. Thank you all for sticking around to hear a nerd talk about a video game. Until next time.